The scream came before the sunrise, and it did not stop for a long time. Elena ran through the dark hallway with her bare feet slapping against cold stone, her heart pounding harder than it ever had. She had heard many strange sounds in the years she worked inside the old palace of Eldermore, but never one like this. It was the sound of a servant who had seen something no living person should see. She reached the chapel doors and pushed them open. Inside, candles flickered along the walls, throwing long shadows across the marble floor. A young maid named Clara stood frozen near the center of the room, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. In front of her stood a glass coffin, tall and polished, resting on a stone platform. Inside it lay a man who had not moved in 6 years. King Adrian Voss. The people of Eldermore called him the Dead King. He had ruled the kingdom once, a young man full of plans and dreams for his people, before a strange illness took hold of his body and never let go. His heart had stopped one evening in the great hall, in front of hundreds of witnesses. The royal physicians had examined him for hours and found no pulse, no breath, nothing. And yet, his body had never grown cold. His skin remained soft. His hair continued to grow. For 6 years, no one dared to bury him, because burying a man who might still be alive felt like a crime no one wanted on their conscience. So they built him a tomb of glass instead, and placed him in the palace chapel, and called it rest instead of death, because rest was easier to say out loud. Elena stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. "Clara, what happened? What did you see?" Clara pointed a trembling finger toward the coffin. "His hand," she whispered. "His hand moved. I swear it moved." Elena looked at the king's still body through the glass. His face was calm, almost peaceful, framed by dark hair that had grown past his shoulders over the years. His hands rested folded over his chest, exactly where they had been placed 6 years ago. Nothing about him looked different now. Nothing about him looked alive. "You must have imagined it," Elena said gently, though her own hands were shaking. "It is early. The candlelight plays tricks on tired eyes." Clara shook her head fiercely. "I know what I saw," his finger twitched. "I was standing right here, cleaning the stone floor, and I heard something, a small sound, like breath." Before Elena could respond, quick footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. A moment later, 2 palace guards burst into the chapel, followed closely by a tall man in fine dark clothing. His face was sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. This was Regent Corvin, the man who had ruled Eldermore in the king's name for the past 6 years, ever since the king's heart had stopped beating. "What is this noise?" Corvin demanded, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. "Do you know what hour it is?" Clara opened her mouth to explain, but fear kept the words trapped in her throat. Elena stepped forward instead, choosing her words carefully. She had learned long ago that survival in this palace meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, and right now, speaking felt dangerous. "Forgive us, my lord," Elena said, bowing her head slightly. Clara was startled by a shadow, nothing more. Corvin's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly toward the glass coffin, his boots clicking against the stone floor, and studied the king's still face for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, something close to unease, though he quickly hid it behind a mask of irritation. "The king does not move," Corvin said flatly. "The king does not breathe. The king is resting, as he has rested for 6 years, and he will continue to rest until his body finally accepts what his mind refused to accept, the day his heart stopped. Do not waste my time with foolish stories again." He turned and walked out of the chapel, his guards following close behind. The heavy doors closed with a deep echo that seemed to swallow the last of the candlelight's warmth. Clara let out a shaking breath once he was gone. "He is afraid," she whispered. "Did you see his face? The regent is afraid of the king waking up." Elena said nothing, but privately she agreed. In 6 years, Regent Corvin had built his own kind of kingdom inside Eldermore. He controlled the treasury, the guards, the trade routes, and the ears of every noble who mattered. A living king would take all of that away from him in a single breath. That thought stayed with Elena long after Clara had gone back to her chores. She was a widow, and she had come to Eldermore 2 years earlier with nothing but a small bag of belongings and her daughter Mira, seeking any work that would put food on their table. The chapel keeper's position had been open because no one else wanted it. People whispered that the room was cursed, that spending too many hours near the dead king's tomb brought bad luck. Elena did not believe in curses. She believed in hunger, and hunger did not care about ghost stories. She finished cleaning the chapel in silence, polishing the brass candle holders, and sweeping the corners where dust liked to gather. As she worked, she found herself glancing again and again at the glass coffin, at the still face of the man everyone in the kingdom knew but no one truly understood. The stories about King Adrian varied, depending on who told them. Some said he had been a cruel and reckless young ruler, cursed by the gods for his mistakes. Others said he had been kind and generous, loved by his people, and that his illness was a tragedy no one deserved. Elena had heard both versions so many times that she no longer knew which one to believe. All she knew for certain was the man in front of her, frozen between life and death, and the strange feeling that settled in her chest whenever she stood too close to him. It was almost like sadness. Not her own sadness, but something that seemed to drift from the glass itself, as if the coffin held more than a body, as if it held a heart that was still somehow beating, quietly, in a rhythm too slow for anyone to hear. By midday, Elena's daughter arrived at the palace kitchen, as she did every day after her lessons with the village tutor ended. Mira was 7 years old, with curly brown hair and eyes the color of warm honey. She was a quiet child most of the time, thoughtful beyond her years, but there was one place in the entire palace that always drew her attention like a magnet. The chapel. "Mama, can I go see him?" Mira asked, tugging gently on Elena's sleeve as her mother finished stacking clean linens in the kitchen storeroom. Elena hesitated. She had allowed Mira to visit the chapel a handful of times before, always under close watch, always for only a few minutes. There was something about the way her daughter behaved around the king's tomb that unsettled her, though she could never quite explain why. Mira never showed fear. Where grown adults lowered their voices and avoided looking directly at the glass, Mira walked right up to it and spoke to the sleeping king as if he were an old friend who simply needed to wake up from a long nap. "A short visit," Elena finally said, "and you must stay quiet. The regent does not like noise near the chapel." Mira nodded eagerly and skipped ahead through the stone corridors, her small feet moving with the kind of light energy only children seem to carry. Elena followed close behind, watching her daughter with a mixture of love and quiet worry. When they reached the chapel, sunlight was pouring through the tall stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns across the floor and across the glass coffin itself. The king's face looked almost golden in the afternoon light, peaceful and untouched by time. Mira walked straight to the coffin and pressed her small palm against the glass, right above where the king's heart would be. "Hello again," she whispered softly. "I missed you." Elena stood near the doorway, watching silently. She had heard Mira speak to the king before, but something about today felt different. The girl's voice carried an odd certainty, as if she truly believed the man inside could hear her. "Mira, sweetheart, remember what I told you," Elena said gently. "He cannot hear us. He is very sick. We should let him rest." Mira turned to look at her mother, and there was something startlingly serious in her young face. "He is not sick, Mama. He is lonely." "There is a difference." Elena felt a strange chill move down her spine at those words, though she could not explain why. She crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, brushing a curl of hair away from Mira's forehead. "What do you mean, lonely?" Elena asked softly. Mira looked back at the glass coffin, studying the king's still face with an expression far too thoughtful for a child her age. His heart is waiting for someone to remind it how to beat. Nobody has held his hand in a long time. Nobody has been close to him. I think that is why he cannot wake up. Elena did not know how to respond to that. She wanted to dismiss it as childish imagination, the kind of story a lonely little girl might invent to make sense of a strange and frightening world. But something in Mira's eyes made the words feel less like imagination and more like something deeper, something Elena could not name. Before she could say anything else, the chapel doors opened again, and Nathaniel, the palace physician, stepped inside carrying a leather satchel. He was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, the kind of eyes that had spent too many years staring at problems he could not solve. "Elena," he said with a small nod of greeting, "I heard there was a disturbance here this morning." Clara was startled, Elena explained carefully. She believed she saw the king's hand move. Nathaniel's expression grew serious. He set his satchel down near the coffin and studied the king's still hands through the glass, his brow furrowing in concentration. "This is not the first such report," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Two of the night guards mentioned something similar last month. They said they heard a faint sound, like breathing, though they dismissed it as the wind." Elena's pulse quickened. "Do you think it is possible that he might still be alive somehow, after all this time?" Nathaniel sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his tired face. "I examined this man myself the night his heart stopped. I found no pulse, no breath. By every measure I know, he should not still look the way he looks today. His body should have decayed years ago. And yet here he lies, unchanged, as if time itself refuses to touch him." He paused, glancing toward Mira, who was still standing close to the coffin, watching the conversation with quiet interest. "There are things about the human body that medicine cannot always explain. I have begun to wonder if his illness was never a natural one at all." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Nathaniel lowered his voice, glancing briefly toward the chapel doors, as if checking that they were truly alone. "I mean that a man does not simply stop breathing, and yet remain untouched by decay for 6 years. There is something unnatural about this illness, something that feels less like sickness and more like poison, slow and deliberate, designed to look like a natural collapse." The word poison hung heavy in the quiet chapel air. Elena felt her stomach tighten. If the king's illness had truly been caused by poison, that meant someone had wanted him gone, someone who had benefited greatly from his sudden fall from power. Someone like Regent Corvin. "You must not repeat what I have told you," Nathaniel said quickly, perhaps realizing he had said more than he intended. "These are only theories. If I am wrong, and someone hears such accusations from my mouth, it could cost me far more than my position here." Elena nodded slowly, though her mind was already spinning with questions. She looked at Mira again, who had gone quiet, her small hand still resting against the glass. The girl's honey-colored eyes seemed distant, as though she were listening to something none of the adults in the room could hear. "Mira," Elena said softly, "it is time to go." Mira did not move right away. Instead, she leaned closer to the glass, pressing her ear against it, as if trying to hear a heartbeat buried deep beneath layers of silence. For a moment, the chapel felt impossibly still, the candlelight barely flickering, the sunlight through the stained glass windows dimming slightly as clouds passed outside. "He is trying," Mira whispered. "He is trying so hard, Mama, but he is too tired to do it alone." Elena gently pulled her daughter away from the coffin, her heart aching with an emotion she could not fully understand. Fear, yes, but also something softer, something that felt almost like hope, fragile and impossible, yet somehow refusing to fade. As they left the chapel that evening, Elena glanced back one final time at the glass coffin glowing faintly in the candlelight. The king's still face looked the same as it always had, calm and distant, a man trapped somewhere between two worlds. But for just a brief moment, as the chapel doors began to close, Elena could have sworn she saw his eyelids tremble, ever so slightly, like the first fragile stirrings of a dream about to end. She told herself it was nothing, tired eyes, playing tricks in dim candlelight, just as she had told Clara that very morning. And yet, walking down the dark corridor with her daughter's small hand tucked safely inside her own, Elena could not shake the feeling that something inside the palace of Eldermore was beginning to change, slowly, quietly, like the first crack spreading across a long frozen lake. Something old was waking up, and nothing in the kingdom would ever be the same again. 3 weeks passed, and the whispers about the dead king grew louder with every passing day. It began with small things. A guard reported that the candles near the chapel burned faster than they should, as though something inside the room was drawing warmth from the flames. A cook claimed that food left near the chapel door had gone cold within minutes, even on the warmest afternoons. None of these stories could be proven, and Regent Corvin dismissed each one with growing impatience. But the servants of Eldermore had long memories, and fear spread through the palace halls faster than any official denial could stop it. Elena tried to keep her focus on her work and her daughter, but the physician's words from that night in the chapel had settled into her mind, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not ignore. Poison. A man who did not die, but whose heart had been forced into silence by someone with a reason to want him gone. The thought followed her through her chores, through her meals, through the quiet hours after Mira had fallen asleep. She began paying closer attention to Regent Corvin, watching him in ways she never had before. She noticed how he avoided the chapel entirely now, sending guards to check on it instead of visiting himself. She noticed how his temper grew shorter whenever anyone mentioned the king's name in his presence. She noticed the way his eyes darted toward the chapel doors whenever he passed them in the hallway, quick and nervous, like a man checking to see if a locked door was still locked. One evening, as Elena carried a basket of fresh linens toward the east wing, she overheard two guards speaking in low voices near the servants' stairwell. She slowed her steps, staying just out of sight behind a stone pillar. "I am telling you, Edward, something is different about him," one guard said. "Last night, I stood watch outside the chapel, same as always, and I could hear it, breathing, slow, but real." The second guard, a broad-shouldered man named Edward, shook his head firmly. "You are letting the old stories get into your head. The dead king has not breathed in 6 years. If he were breathing now, the whole kingdom would know about it." "I know what I heard," the first guard insisted. "And I am not the only one. Ask the maid, Clara. Ask anyone who has stood near that room after midnight. Something is happening in there." Edward glanced around nervously before lowering his voice even further. "Even if you are right, keep your mouth shut about it. The regent does not want to hear such things. You know what happened to the last guard who spoke too freely about the king waking up." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors before about a guard who had been dismissed from the palace under mysterious circumstances several months earlier, but she had never known the reason. Now, standing frozen behind the stone pillar, she understood. Someone had spoken too openly about the possibility of the king's return, and Regent Corvin had made certain that voice would not be heard again. She waited until the guards moved on before continuing down the hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. If the king truly was showing signs of life, and if Corvin was working to silence anyone who noticed, then the danger inside Eldermore was far greater than she had imagined. Not just for the king trapped in his glass coffin, but for anyone who dared to speak the truth out loud. That night, after Mira had eaten her supper and changed into her sleeping gown, she climbed onto Elena's lap by the small fireplace in their quarters, her honey-colored eyes bright with the kind of curiosity only children seem to carry into even the most serious conversations. "Mama, why does everyone whisper about the king now?" Mira asked. "I hear the maids talking when they think I am not listening." Elena considered her words carefully before answering. She did not want to frighten her daughter, but she also did not believe in lying to her, not about something this important. "Some people believe the king might be waking up," she said gently. "After all these years." Mira's face lit up with a smile so bright it startled Elena. "I knew it," she whispered excitedly. "I told you, Mama. He was just tired." He needed someone to remind his heart how to beat again. "Mira, listen to me carefully," Elena said, her tone growing more serious. "This is not something we should speak about outside of our own quarters. Not to the other maids. Not to the guards. Not to anyone. Do you understand?" Mira's excitement faded slightly, replaced by confusion. "Why not? Isn't it good news? Shouldn't everyone be happy?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much truth a 7-year-old could carry without carrying fear alongside it. But she decided honesty, even a small dose of it, was safer than leaving her daughter blind to the danger around them. "Some people in this palace have grown very comfortable ruling in the king's place," she said carefully. "If he wakes up, they will lose everything they have built for themselves. That kind of loss can make people do dangerous things to protect what they have." Mira's small face grew thoughtful, and for a moment, she looked far older than her 7 years. "You mean the regent," she said quietly. It was not a question. Elena did not answer directly, but her silence was answer enough. She pulled her daughter close. pressing a soft kiss against the top of her curly hair. "Promise me you will be careful, Mira. Promise me you will not speak of this to anyone outside these walls." "I promise," Mira whispered, though her eyes drifted toward the small window of their quarters, staring out into the darkness, in the direction of the palace chapel, as if some invisible thread connected her heart to the sleeping kings. Over the following days, Elena noticed a change in her daughter's behavior that both worried and fascinated her. Mira began waking earlier than usual, insisting on visiting the chapel before her lessons with the village tutor began. She spoke less during meals, often lost in quiet thought, and her small notebook, once filled with drawings of flowers and animals, now contained careful sketches of the glass coffin and the sleeping man inside it. One afternoon, while cleaning the chapel, Elena found Mira sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor beside the coffin, humming a soft, wordless tune that Elena did not recognize. "What are you singing, sweetheart?" Elena asked, setting down her cleaning cloth. Mira looked up, her expression calm and dreamy, as if she had just woken from a pleasant nap. "I don't know. It just came to me. I think it is a song he used to know." Elena's chest tightened with a familiar unease. "Mira, how would you know a song that belongs to someone you have never truly met?" Mira shrugged, her attention already drifting back toward the coffin. "I don't know, Mama. Sometimes when I sit near him, I feel things. Little pieces of memories, like they are floating in the air around him, waiting for someone to catch them." Elena did not know what to make of such words. Part of her wanted to dismiss them as the wild imagination of a lonely child who spent too much time in a quiet, mysterious room. But another part of her, the part that had watched Clara's terrified face weeks earlier, the part that had overheard two guards speaking of breathing in the dead of night, could not ignore the growing pattern forming around her daughter's strange connection to the sleeping king. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains surrounding Eldermoor, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. She approached Nathaniel, the palace physician, in the quiet corner of the palace gardens, where he often took his evening walks. "I need to ask you something," Elena said, keeping her voice low despite the emptiness of the garden path. "You said the king's illness felt unnatural to you. Do you believe there is a way to reverse whatever was done to him?" Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his tired eyes weighing the question carefully before he answered. "In all my years of practicing medicine, I have never encountered anything quite like this. His body defies every explanation I have. But if I am right, and this was never a natural illness, then perhaps it is not a natural cure that will wake him either." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Nathaniel glanced around the empty garden once more before continuing, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are old stories, passed down through generations of healers, about illnesses that steal a person's spirit rather than their body. In such cases, medicine alone cannot heal the wound. Sometimes, what is needed is something far simpler and far harder to find. Genuine warmth, genuine connection. A reminder, given freely and without fear, that the world outside still wants them to return to it." Elena thought immediately of Mira, sitting cross-legged beside the glass coffin, humming songs she should have no way of knowing, speaking of little pieces of memory floating in the air. A chill ran down her spine, though it was not entirely a chill of fear. "You believe someone could reach him," Elena said slowly. "Someone whose presence he could somehow feel, even trapped as he is." Nathaniel's expression grew guarded, almost cautious. "I believe it is possible. I have seen stranger things happen in illnesses that defy explanation. But I would caution you, Elena, if Regent Corvin discovers that anyone is attempting to wake the king, whether through medicine, ritual, or simple human kindness, the consequences could be severe. He has made it very clear, through both words and silence, that the current arrangement suits him far better than the alternative." Elena nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his warning. She thanked Nathaniel for his honesty, and walked back toward her quarters, beneath a sky now fully dark, scattered with distant stars. Her mind raced with possibilities, fears, and a strange, stubborn thread of hope that refused to be silenced, no matter how hard she tried to reason it away. When she reached her quarters, she found Mira already asleep in her small bed, her breathing soft and even, her small hand curled loosely against her chest. Elena sat beside her for a long while, watching her daughter's peaceful face in the dim candlelight, wondering what strange gift or burden had settled itself inside such a young and gentle heart. Outside, somewhere across the palace grounds, the chapel stood silent and still beneath the stars, the glass coffin glowing faintly with reflected moonlight. And inside that coffin, though no one in the palace yet knew it for certain, the King of Eldermoor lay caught between two worlds, his heart beating so faintly it could barely be called a heartbeat at all, waiting, patiently and desperately, for someone brave enough and innocent enough to reach through the silence and pull him back into the light. The kingdom did not know it yet, but the slow crack in the frozen lake Elena had sensed weeks earlier had grown wider that very night, spreading further with every whispered rumor, every nervous glance from a guard who knew too much, every soft, wordless song hummed by a child who somehow understood a stranger's heart better than anyone else alive. Change was coming to Eldermoor, quiet and unstoppable, like the first true breath drawn after 6 long years of silence. The storm arrived without warning, on a night when the moon hid behind thick, rolling clouds, and it was the storm that changed everything. Rain hammered against the palace windows, and thunder rolled across the mountains surrounding Eldermoor, like the growl of some enormous, unseen creature. Elena had put Mira to bed early that evening, hoping the sound of rain against the roof would lull her daughter into a deep and restful sleep. But sometime after midnight, Elena woke to find the small bed beside her own empty, the blankets pushed back, the window slightly open, letting in a cold, damp breeze. Panic seized her chest instantly. She threw on her shawl and rushed out into the dark corridor, calling her daughter's name in a harsh whisper, afraid to raise her voice too loudly and alert the night guards. She checked the kitchen, the gardens, the small courtyard where Mira sometimes liked to watch the stars, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Then, with a sinking certainty, Elena knew exactly where her daughter had gone. She ran through the palace halls, her bare feet slapping against cold stone, her heart pounding harder with every step. When she reached the chapel doors, she found them slightly ajar, a thin sliver of candlelight spilling out into the dark hallway. She pushed them open and stepped inside, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Mira had climbed onto the stone platform where the glass coffin rested. Her small body lay curled against the cool glass, directly above where the king's heart would be, one hand pressed flat against the surface, her cheek resting gently beside it. She looked peaceful, fast asleep, as though she had simply chosen the strangest bed in the entire kingdom and found it perfectly comfortable. Mira, Elena rushed forward, her voice trembling with fear and relief all at once, but as she reached the platform, something made her stop in her tracks. A faint light glowed beneath the glass, soft and golden, pulsing gently, like the rhythm of a slow, steady heartbeat. It came from directly beneath Mira's small hand, spreading outward across the king's chest, in delicate threads of warm color, fading and returning, like a candle flame caught in a light breeze. Elena stood frozen, staring at the impossible sight before her. She had heard the guards whisper about strange sounds and faint movements, but nothing had prepared her for this. The king's face, usually still and pale as marble, now held the faintest hint of color in his cheeks. His chest, motionless for 6 long years, appeared to rise, ever so slightly, then fall again, in a slow and fragile rhythm that had not existed the day before. "Mira, sweetheart, wake up," Elena said softly, gently touching her daughter's shoulder. Mira stirred slowly, blinking her honey-colored eyes open, looking not startled but calm, as though waking from the most natural sleep in the world. "Mama," she murmured drowsily. "He's warm now, feel it." Elena hesitated, then reached out and pressed her own palm gently against the glass. She felt it immediately, a warmth radiating from within, unmistakable and undeniable, where there had only ever been cold, lifeless glass before. Tears filled Elena's eyes, though she could not fully explain whether they came from fear or wonder, or some tangled combination of both. She lifted Mira gently into her arms, cradling her close, and turned to leave the chapel before anyone else could discover what had happened. But it was already too late. A guard stood in the doorway, his lantern raised, his face pale with shock as he stared past Elena, toward the glowing coffin behind her. It was Edward, the broad-shouldered guard who had dismissed his fellow soldiers' stories only weeks earlier as foolish superstition. Now, standing witness to the impossible light pulsing beneath the glass, his skepticism had vanished entirely, replaced by something closer to awe. What is happening in here?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's mind raced, searching desperately for an explanation that would not endanger her daughter or herself. "I do not know," she said honestly, because in truth, she did not fully understand it herself. "My daughter wandered in during the storm. I came to bring her back to bed." Edward stepped further into the chapel, his lantern light flickering across the glowing coffin. He stared at the king's chest, watching the faint rise and fall of what had been stillness for 6 long years, and his hand trembled slightly as he lowered the lantern. "I need to report this," he said finally, though there was uncertainty in his voice, as if he were not entirely sure reporting it was the right choice. "Please," Elena said quickly, stepping forward. "If you tell the regent, I do not know what will happen to my daughter. You know how Corvin feels about anyone speaking of the king waking. You know what happened to the guard who spoke too freely months ago." Edward's jaw tightened. He glanced between Elena, the sleeping child in her arms, and the softly glowing coffin, clearly torn between his duty to report unusual events within the palace, and a growing unease about what Regent Corvin might do with such information. "I will not report your daughter," he said finally, his voice low and firm, "but I cannot stay silent about the light. Too many guards have already noticed strange occurrences near this chapel. If I say nothing, and it is discovered later that I saw this, and remained quiet, my own position here will be at risk." Elena understood the impossible position he found himself in, caught between loyalty to his duties and a growing suspicion that something deeply wrong had been done to the sleeping king years earlier. "Then tell him only of the light," she said carefully. "Leave Mira out of your report entirely, please." Edward studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Take your daughter back to your quarters. I will report the light alone, and say I discovered it during my rounds." Elena thanked him quietly and hurried from the chapel, carrying Mira through the dark corridors back toward their small quarters. Her mind spun with fear and disbelief in equal measure. She had suspected, deep down, that something extraordinary connected her daughter to the sleeping king, ever since Mira first spoke of his loneliness weeks earlier. But witnessing the glowing light with her own eyes, feeling the warmth beneath her palm where cold glass should have been, made the impossible suddenly, terrifyingly real. She laid Mira gently back into her own small bed, tucking the blankets carefully around her small shoulders. Mira's eyes fluttered open once more, heavy with sleep, but calm and content. "He remembers something now, Mama," Mira murmured softly. "A little piece of who he used to be. I could feel it." "What did you feel, sweetheart?" Elena asked gently, brushing a curl of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Sadness," Mira whispered, "but also hope. He wants to come back. He is just scared that no one is waiting for him anymore." Elena's heart ached at those words, though she did not fully understand how a young child could sense such complicated emotions from a man trapped in silence for 6 long years. She kissed her daughter's forehead gently and stayed beside her until sleep finally claimed the small, exhausted girl once more. Elena did not sleep at all that night. She sat by the small fireplace in their quarters, staring into the dying embers, replaying the golden light pulsing beneath the glass, over and over in her mind. Somewhere deep within her, a fragile hope had taken root, stubborn and impossible to ignore, no matter how dangerous such hope might prove to be within the walls of Eldermore. By morning, word of the strange light in the chapel had already begun spreading through the palace like wildfire through dry grass. Servants whispered about it over breakfast preparations. Guards exchanged nervous glances as they changed shifts. Even the nobles, usually far too concerned with their own affairs to care about palace gossip, began murmuring questions about the dead king and the strange golden glow witnessed within his tomb. Regent Corvin summoned Edward to his private chambers before the sun had fully risen, and though Elena was not present to witness the conversation, she heard from Clara later that afternoon that the regent had left the meeting looking pale and deeply shaken, a stark contrast to his usual composed and commanding presence. For the first time in 6 years, it seemed Regent Corvin truly believed the king might return. And for the first time in 6 years, the entire kingdom of Eldermore held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Regent Corvin did not sleep for 3 nights after Edward's report reached his ears, and by the 4th morning, his patience had worn down to something dangerously thin. He summoned every senior member of the palace staff to the Great Hall, his voice sharp and commanding, as he addressed them beneath the tall painted ceilings that had once celebrated the coronation of King Adrian himself. Elena stood near the back of the room, holding her hands tightly clasped in front of her, watching the regent pace back and forth across the polished floor, like a caged animal searching for a way out. "I have heard enough foolish stories about lights and breathing and miracles," Corvin announced, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "The kingdom cannot function on rumors and superstition. As of today, the chapel will be closed to all staff, except those I personally assign. No one enters without my direct permission. Anyone caught disobeying this order will be dismissed from palace service immediately." Murmurs rippled through the gathered staff, but no one dared to speak against him openly. Elena felt her stomach twist with dread. If the chapel was sealed off entirely, there would be no way for Mira to return, no way to continue whatever strange, fragile connection had begun forming between her daughter and the sleeping king. After the meeting ended and the staff dispersed to their duties, Elena caught sight of Nathaniel lingering near one of the tall stone pillars, his expression troubled. She approached him quietly, careful to keep her voice low. "He is afraid," Elena said. "More afraid than I have ever seen him." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Fear makes men do desperate things, Elena. I worry what lengths Corvin might go to in order to protect the power he has built over these past 6 years. Do you think he would harm the king further?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's expression grew grim. "I do not know for certain, but I have requested to examine the king again, given the reports of warmth and movement, and Corvin has denied my request twice already. That alone tells me something is deeply wrong." Elena's fear deepened, but so did her resolve. She thought of Mira's words from the night of the storm, the sadness and hope she claimed to feel, radiating from the sleeping king, his desperate wish to return, paired with a fear that no one waited for him anymore. If Corvin succeeded in cutting off all access to the chapel, that fragile hope might never have the chance to grow into something real. Over the following days, Elena noticed the palace grow tense, in ways she had never experienced before. Guards were posted permanently outside the chapel doors, their expressions stern and unwavering. Staff members who had once freely discussed the strange occurrences fell silent whenever Corvin's name was mentioned, glancing nervously over their shoulders as though the regent's spies might be listening from the shadows. Mira, sensing the shift in her mother's mood, grew increasingly restless. She asked daily about visiting the chapel, her honey-colored eyes filled with a quiet desperation that broke Elena's heart each time she was forced to explain that it was no longer allowed. "He needs me, Mama," Mira insisted one evening, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I can feel it. He is trying so hard, and now there is no one there to help him." Elena pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, holding her close as she searched for words that might offer some small comfort. "I know, sweetheart. I promise we will find a way. But right now, we must be patient and careful. If we act foolishly, we could lose the chance entirely." That night, after Mira had finally cried herself to sleep, Elena sat alone by the fireplace, turning over every possibility in her mind. She thought of Edward, the guard who had chosen to protect Mira's secret, despite the risk to his own position. Perhaps, she thought, he might be willing to help once more. The following afternoon, Elena found Edward standing watch near the palace stables, away from the prying eyes and ears that filled the main corridors. She approached him carefully, choosing her words with great caution. "I need your help," she said quietly. "My daughter believes she can help the king recover, but the chapel has been sealed. Is there any way to gain access, even briefly?" Edward's expression grew troubled. He glanced around the empty stable yard before answering. "The regent has ordered new locks placed on the chapel doors. Only he and 2 of his most trusted guards hold the keys. I am not among them any longer, not since I reported the strange light." Elena's heart sank at this news, but Edward continued, his voice dropping even lower. There is another way into the chapel, however. An old servant's passage runs beneath the east wing, built generations ago for the priests who once tended the chapel privately. Very few people know it still exists. I discovered it by accident during my early years of service here. Hope flickered cautiously in Elena's chest. Can you show me? Edward hesitated, clearly weighing the risk to himself against the strange pull of curiosity and concern that had settled over him since witnessing the golden light with his own eyes. Finally, he nodded. I will show you the entrance, but what you choose to do with it afterward is your own decision. I cannot risk being seen assisting you directly again. That night, once the palace had settled into its usual quiet rhythm of distant footsteps and flickering torchlight, Edward led Elena and a sleepy but determined Mira through a hidden door concealed behind a tapestry in the east wing's lower corridor. Beyond it lay a narrow stone passage, damp and cold, lit only by the single lantern Edward carried. This passage leads directly beneath the chapel floor, Edward whispered, guiding them carefully through the dim tunnel. There is a hidden panel near the altar that opens from below. Be careful, and be quick. If you are discovered, I know nothing of this. Elena thanked him quietly, and Edward disappeared back through the hidden door, leaving them alone in the narrow passage, with only the soft glow of a small candle Elena had brought along. Mira gripped her mother's hand tightly as they made their way through the darkness, her small footsteps quick and eager, despite the late hour. They found the hidden panel exactly where Edward had described, and after a few moments of careful searching, Elena discovered the small mechanism that released it. The panel swung open silently, revealing the familiar stone floor of the chapel above, bathed in soft moonlight streaming through the tall stained glass windows. Mira rushed forward the moment they climbed through, her small feet moving swiftly across the cold stone toward the glass coffin resting at the center of the room. Elena followed close behind, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. As Mira pressed her palm against the glass once more, the faint golden light returned almost instantly, pulsing gently beneath the surface, spreading outward in delicate threads across the king's still chest. This time, the light seemed brighter than before, more insistent, as though it had been waiting impatiently for her return. He missed me, Mira whispered softly, climbing carefully onto the stone platform to rest against the glass, just as she had during the storm. He was so scared, Mama. He thought I wasn't coming back. Elena watched in quiet amazement as the king's chest rose and fell more steadily than she had ever witnessed before, his breathing growing slightly deeper, slightly stronger, with each passing minute that Mira remained close to him. She reached out and gently touched the glass herself, feeling the warmth radiating from within, undeniable proof that whatever strange and impossible bond connected her daughter to the sleeping king, it was growing stronger with each visit. They stayed for nearly an hour before Elena finally insisted they return through the hidden passage before the night guards began their rounds. As they climbed back down into the narrow tunnel, Mira looked back one final time toward the glowing coffin, her small face filled with quiet determination. I will come back, she whispered softly, more to herself than to her mother. I promise. Over the following weeks, Elena and Mira returned to the hidden passage under the cover of darkness, whenever they safely could, always careful to avoid detection, always careful to leave no trace of their visits behind. Each time, the golden light grew brighter, and each time, the king's breathing grew steadier, until even the guards stationed outside the sealed chapel doors began whispering nervously among themselves about strange sounds echoing faintly from within a room they were certain no one had entered. Regent Corvin remained unaware of the hidden passage, confident that his sealed doors and posted guards had successfully cut off all access to the chapel. But deep beneath his careful control, in the shadows of a forgotten servant's tunnel built generations before his rule began, a quiet, determined little girl continued keeping her promise, one secret visit at a time, slowly and steadily coaxing a broken heart back toward the light. It was Clara who nearly ruined everything, though not through any fault of her own. 6 weeks after the storm that had first revealed the golden light, Clara noticed something odd while delivering fresh candles to the sealed chapel doors under Corvin's direct instruction. A thin layer of dust near the base of one wall tapestry in the east wing corridor appeared disturbed, small footprints visible in a pattern too light and too small to belong to any adult. Being naturally curious, and having grown fond of little Mira over the past 2 years, Clara said nothing to the guards, but she began watching more carefully, and it did not take her long to notice Elena and Mira slipping quietly through the hidden passage late one evening. Rather than report what she had seen, Clara waited nervously by the tapestry until they returned, her heart pounding with uncertainty about what she should do next. "Elena," Clara whispered urgently the moment Elena and Mira emerged from the narrow passage, "what are you doing? Do you understand what would happen if the regent discovered this?" Elena froze, her hand instinctively tightening around Mira's shoulder, pulling her daughter protectively closer. For a long moment, she considered lying, inventing some excuse about searching for a lost item, or exploring old palace corridors out of curiosity. But something in Clara's worried expression told her that honesty, carefully shared, might be the wiser choice. "Please," Elena said quietly, "come with us somewhere private, and I will explain everything." They retreated to Elena's small quarters, and once the door was safely closed behind them, Elena told Clara everything. She spoke of the golden light, the warmth beneath the glass, Nathaniel's suspicions about poison, and Mira's strange and unexplainable connection to the sleeping king. Clara listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening further with each new detail. "I believed something strange was happening in that chapel from the very beginning," Clara finally said, once Elena had finished. "I saw his hand move myself, that very first morning. Everyone told me I imagined it, but I know what I saw." "You cannot tell anyone," Elena said firmly. "Not the other maids, not the guards, no one. If Corvin discovers what Mira has been doing, I do not know what he might do to protect his position." Clara nodded slowly, her expression turning thoughtful. "I will keep your secret, Elena, but I want to help, if I can. I have grown to care for that little girl, as though she were my own younger sister. If there is truly a chance to bring the king back, I want to be part of it." Over the following days, Clara proved to be an invaluable and unexpected ally. Working within the palace kitchens gave her access to information the guards and nobles rarely shared openly, and she began quietly gathering small details about Corvin's growing anxiety. She learned that the regent had begun meeting privately and frequently with a mysterious visitor who arrived late at night through the palace's rear gates, always cloaked and hooded, never announced by name to the household staff. "I do not know who this visitor is," Clara reported to Elena one evening, as they sat together folding linens in the quiet kitchen storeroom. "But the guards who escort him inside seem deeply uneasy in his presence. One of them told me his hands are always gloved, even indoors, and that he carries a small wooden case wherever he goes." Elena's stomach twisted uneasily at this description. She thought immediately of Nathaniel's theory about poison, slow and deliberate, designed to look like natural illness. Could this mysterious visitor be connected somehow to whatever had been done to the king 6 years earlier? "We need to learn more about this man," Elena said carefully. "If he is connected to what happened to King Adrian, it could explain why Corvin has grown so desperate to keep the chapel sealed." Clara agreed to continue watching quietly, careful never to draw suspicion toward herself. Meanwhile, Elena and Mira continued their secret nighttime visits through the hidden passage, and with each visit, the transformation within the glass coffin grew more undeniable. By the 7th week, Mira reported that she could sometimes hear faint whispers when she rested close to the glass, fragments of thought and memory drifting from the king's slowly awakening mind, like scattered pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. "He remembers a garden," Mira told her mother one night, as they made their way back through the hidden passage. "A garden with white flowers, and someone laughing. I think it might be his mother." "The Queen Mother passed away many years before his illness," Elena said gently, recalling the old palace records she had once overheard discussed among the senior staff. "Perhaps he is remembering his childhood." Mira nodded thoughtfully. "He is scared of something too, Mama. Something dark. I feel it sometimes, right before the warm feelings come, like a shadow trying to hold him down." Elena's chest tightened with worry at these words. If the king's illness truly had been caused deliberately, by poison or some other unnatural means, it was entirely possible that whatever force had been used against him still lingered somewhere within his body, fighting against the fragile progress Mira's presence continued to encourage. She resolved to speak with Nathaniel again as soon as possible, hoping his medical knowledge might offer some insight into the shadow Mira described. She found him the following afternoon in the small palace library, poring over old medical texts with an intensity that suggested he too had been searching for answers in every place he could think to look. "I have been researching illnesses that mimic death for weeks now," Nathaniel admitted when Elena approached him quietly. "There are certain rare substances, difficult to obtain, and even more difficult to detect, capable of slowing the body's functions to the point where death appears to have occurred, while leaving the mind trapped in a state of suspended awareness." "Would such a substance require continued doses to maintain its effect?" Elena asked, thinking of the mysterious hooded visitor Clara had described. Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly at the question. Yes, in most cases described in the old texts, the effect would naturally begin to fade over time, unless reinforced periodically. If someone has been secretly administering additional doses to the king over these past 6 years, it would explain why his condition has remained so consistent, despite the natural expectation that such an effect would eventually wear off entirely. Elena's blood ran cold at the implication. If Corvin's mysterious visitor was indeed delivering continued doses of whatever substance had first caused the king's collapse, it meant the regent was not simply benefiting from a tragic accident. He was actively, deliberately, continuing to suppress the king's recovery, year after year, in order to maintain his own power. "We need proof," Elena said firmly. "Without proof, no one will believe such an accusation against the regent, especially not while he controls every guard and advisor within these palace walls." Nathaniel nodded gravely. "I will continue my research quietly. Perhaps I can identify the substance if given the chance to examine the king directly once more. But Corvin has denied my requests repeatedly. I fear he suspects I am growing too curious for his comfort." That evening, as Elena walked back toward her quarters lost deep in thought, she nearly collided with Regent Corvin himself as he emerged suddenly from a side corridor, flanked by 2 of his most trusted guards. His sharp eyes studied her carefully, lingering a moment too long, as though searching for some hidden truth behind her carefully composed expression. "Elena," he said coolly, "I understand your daughter has grown quite attached to wandering the palace corridors at unusual hours." Elena's heart nearly stopped. She forced herself to remain calm, keeping her voice steady despite the fear rushing through her veins. "Children often struggle to sleep through storms, my lord. She simply wandered from our quarters once during a night of thunder. It will not happen again." Corvin's gaze remained fixed on her for a long, uncomfortable moment, before he finally allowed a thin, humorless smile to cross his lips. "See that it does not. I have grown weary of foolish rumors distracting my staff from their duties. The chapel remains sealed for good reason, and I expect that order to be respected without exception." He turned and walked away, his guards following closely behind, leaving Elena standing alone in the dim corridor with her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She did not know for certain whether Corvin truly suspected the truth behind their secret visits, or whether his words had simply been a general warning meant to discourage curiosity among the staff. But either way, one thing had become painfully clear. Time was running out, and the danger surrounding their fragile, secret hope had grown far more serious than Elena had ever anticipated. The hooded visitor arrived again 3 nights later, and this time, Clara was ready. She had positioned herself near the kitchen entrance closest to the palace's rear gates, pretending to sort through supply crates while secretly watching the shadowed pathway that led toward Corvin's private study. When the familiar cloaked figure appeared, moving with quiet, practiced steps past the night guards who seemed almost trained to look away, Clara's pulse quickened with a mixture of fear and determination. She waited until the man disappeared into the private study before slipping quietly down the corridor herself, careful to stay hidden within the shadows cast by the flickering wall torches. She could not risk getting close enough to hear their conversation clearly, but through a narrow gap where the study door had not been fully closed, she managed to catch fragments of hushed voices. "The dosage must increase," the hooded visitor said, his voice low and rough. "The girl's presence is accelerating his recovery faster than expected. What I gave you before will no longer be sufficient." "I do not care what it costs," Corvin's voice replied sharply. Whatever you require, I will provide it. He cannot wake. Not now. Not ever, if I can help it. Clara's blood ran cold as she listened. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. Regent Corvin had been deliberately poisoning the king for 6 long years, and now, faced with the unexpected miracle of Mira's presence, slowly breaking through whatever unnatural sleep had been forced upon him, he intended to increase the danger rather than allow the truth to surface. She hurried away from the study before she could be discovered, her heart pounding as she rushed to find Elena. She found her in the palace laundry room, folding freshly washed linens with quick, practiced movements. "Elena," Clara whispered urgently, pulling her aside into a quiet corner. "I heard them. Corvin and the hooded man. He is planning to increase the poison. He said, the girl's presence is working too well, and he cannot allow the king to wake." Elena's hands went still, the linen she had been folding slipping unnoticed to the floor. "We have proof now," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with the weight of what she had just learned. "Real proof. Proof that only exists in what I overheard," Clara said grimly. "Nothing written. Nothing that could be shown to anyone who might challenge Corvin's authority. He would simply deny it, and I would be the one dismissed from palace service, or worse, for spreading such dangerous accusations against him." Elena's mind raced, searching desperately for a solution. They needed something concrete, something undeniable, if they hoped to expose Corvin's deception before he succeeded in increasing whatever poison had kept the king trapped for so many years. "Nathaniel," Elena said suddenly, "if he could examine the king directly, even briefly, he might be able to identify the substance being used. That, combined with what you overheard, might be enough to convince the other nobles that something is deeply wrong." That very night, Elena, Clara, and Mira made their way once more through the hidden passage beneath the east wing, this time bringing Nathaniel along with them, his old leather satchel filled with instruments and small glass vials for collecting samples. The physician's expression remained grave and focused as they guided him carefully through the narrow stone tunnel toward the hidden panel beneath the chapel floor. Once inside the moonlit chapel, Nathaniel approached the glass coffin with careful, practiced movements, examining the seal along its edges before gently testing whether it could be opened without disturbing whatever delicate condition had kept the king suspended for so long. "The seal is not permanent," he murmured, half to himself, as he worked. "It was designed to be opened, likely for exactly this kind of periodic treatment Corvin's visitor has been providing." With careful precision, Nathaniel managed to release the seal along one edge of the glass coffin, just enough to slide a thin instrument inside and collect a small sample from the fabric near the king's still form, along with a careful examination of his skin and breathing patterns. Throughout the entire process, Mira remained close by, her small hand resting gently against the king's arm, humming the same wordless, gentle tune she had hummed weeks earlier. "His breathing is stronger than my previous examination showed," Nathaniel noted quietly, listening carefully with an instrument pressed against the king's chest. "His heartbeat, while still faint, has grown steadier as well. Whatever bond your daughter shares with him, Elena, it is genuinely working against whatever has been keeping him suppressed." As Nathaniel carefully resealed the coffin, ensuring no trace of their visit would be visible to anyone inspecting it later, Mira suddenly gasped softly, her small hand pressing more firmly against the glass. "He's afraid," she whispered urgently. "Something is coming. Something dark and heavy, like before, but stronger." Elena felt a chill move through her entire body. "The increased dosage," she said quietly. "Corvin's visitor must have already begun administering it." Nathaniel's expression grew deeply troubled. "If that is true, we may not have much time before whatever progress has been made is reversed entirely, or worse, before the increased dosage causes lasting harm that even his current strange resilience cannot overcome." They left the chapel that night with a growing sense of urgency, pressing heavily upon them. As they made their way back through the hidden passage, Elena's mind spun with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Confronting Corvin directly seemed impossible, given his control over the palace guards and his willingness to silence anyone who threatened his position. Seeking help from the nobles carried its own risks, since many of them had grown comfortable under Corvin's rule, and might not welcome the disruption a returning king would bring to their own carefully balanced influence. "There is one person who might help us," Nathaniel said quietly, as they climbed back into the quiet, dark corridor of the East Wing. Lady Rosalind, the former royal advisor. She served King Adrian's own mother many years ago, and was dismissed from her position shortly after Corvin assumed control as regent. She has always maintained her belief that something felt deeply wrong about the king's sudden collapse. "Do you trust her?" Elena asked carefully. "I do," Nathaniel said firmly. "She lives now in a small cottage near the eastern edge of the kingdom, far from palace politics, but she still maintains connections among the older nobility who remember King Adrian fondly from his early years of rule. If anyone could help rally support against Corvin's deception, it would be her." They agreed that Nathaniel would travel to seek out Lady Rosalind the following morning, under the guise of visiting a distant relative, to avoid drawing suspicion from Corvin's watchful guards. Meanwhile, Elena and Clara would continue monitoring the situation within the palace, watching carefully for any further sign of the hooded visitor's return. As Elena finally settled Mira into bed that night, exhaustion and worry weighing heavily upon her, her daughter reached out and grasped her hand tightly. "Mama, promise me we won't stop helping him," Mira whispered, her honey-colored eyes filled with a determination far beyond her 7 years. "Even if it becomes dangerous, he needs us now more than ever." Elena looked down at her daughter's small, earnest face, and despite every fear coursing through her heart, she found herself nodding firmly. "I promise, sweetheart. We will not stop. No matter how dangerous it becomes, we will see this through until the very end." Outside, beyond their small quarters, the palace of Eldermore settled into an uneasy quiet, the calm surface hiding a storm of secrets, danger, and fragile hope building steadily beneath it, waiting for the moment it would finally break free into the open. Nathaniel returned from his journey 4 days later, and the moment Elena saw his face, she knew something had shifted in their favor. He found her in the palace gardens during the quiet hour before evening meals, where she had taken to walking whenever worry grew too heavy to bear indoors. His expression carried a cautious optimism she had not seen in him since their earliest conversations about the king's mysterious condition. "Lady Rosalind agreed to help us," Nathaniel said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "More than that, she revealed something I did not expect. She has long suspected Corvin's involvement in the king's collapse, and she has been quietly gathering allies among the older nobility for years, waiting for the right moment and the right proof to act against him." Elena's heart lifted with cautious hope. "Did you tell her everything? About Mira? About the hooded visitor? About the sample you collected?" Nathaniel nodded. She examined the sample herself, using knowledge passed down from her own years working alongside royal physicians. "She confirmed my suspicions. The substance matches descriptions of a rare and carefully guarded poison known in old medical texts as nightroot extract, capable of mimicking death while leaving the mind trapped in a state of prolonged unconsciousness. It requires continued doses to maintain its effect, exactly as I suspected." "Then we have our proof," Elena said, though her voice carried a note of caution rather than triumph. "But how do we present it without giving Corvin the chance to silence us first?" Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "Lady Rosalind believes the safest approach is to gather enough noble support quietly, before confronting Corvin openly, ensuring he cannot simply dismiss the accusation or move against us individually, before the truth becomes impossible to hide. She has already begun reaching out discreetly to several trusted families who remember King Adrian's early rule fondly and have grown increasingly uneasy under Corvin's control these past 6 years." Over the following 2 weeks, a careful and quiet campaign began building beneath the surface of palace life, invisible to Corvin's watchful eyes, but steadily gaining momentum among those who had long harbored doubts about his rule. Lady Rosalind traveled discreetly between noble estates, sharing what she had learned with families she trusted completely, while Nathaniel continued his careful research, strengthening the medical evidence that would be needed to expose the truth beyond any possible denial. Meanwhile, Elena and Mira continued their secret nighttime visits to the chapel, though the dark shadow Mira had sensed weeks earlier seemed to grow heavier with each passing visit, a clear sign that Corvin's increased doses were indeed working against whatever fragile progress had been made. "He is fighting so hard, Mama," Mira told her mother one night, tears gathering in her eyes as she rested against the glass coffin. "But it is getting harder for him. The dark feeling comes faster now, and it stays longer." Elena felt her chest tighten with worry and helpless frustration. She wanted desperately to speed up their efforts, to confront Corvin immediately, and end the danger threatening the king's fragile recovery, but she understood the wisdom in Lady Rosalind's careful, patient approach. Acting too quickly, without sufficient support, risked losing everything they had worked so hard to build. "Stay strong, sweetheart," Elena whispered, holding her daughter close. "We are getting closer every day. I promise you, we will not fail him." One evening, as Elena carried supplies through the palace corridors, she overheard hushed voices near Corvin's private study once more. This time, it was not the hooded visitor's voice she recognized, but that of one of Corvin's senior advisors, a thin, nervous man named Gideon, who had served the regent loyally for years. "My lord, several of the noble families have grown unusually quiet these past weeks," Gideon's voice carried through the partially open door. "Lady Rosalind's name has come up more than once in conversations my informants have overheard. I fear she may be organizing something against your rule." Corvin's response carried an edge of barely controlled anger. "Rosalind has always been a thorn in my side, ever since I removed her from her position. If she is stirring trouble among the nobility, I want to know immediately, watch her closely, and report anything unusual without delay." Elena hurried away before she could be discovered listening, her heart pounding with renewed urgency. Corvin was growing suspicious, and if he uncovered Lady Rosalind's efforts before they had gathered enough support to confront him safely, everything they had worked toward could collapse entirely, leaving the king trapped in his unnatural sleep forever, and placing everyone involved in grave danger. She rushed to find Nathaniel immediately, sharing what she had overheard. His expression grew grim as he listened. "We must accelerate our timeline," he said firmly. "Lady Rosalind believed we needed more time to gather sufficient support. But if Corvin's suspicions continue growing, we may not have that luxury. I will send word to her tonight, urging her to move forward with whatever support she has already secured." That night, as Elena and Mira made their now familiar journey through the hidden passage toward the chapel, an unexpected obstacle awaited them. The hidden panel beneath the altar, which had always opened smoothly with a simple mechanism, refused to budge, despite Elena's careful efforts. "It's locked somehow," Elena whispered, growing increasingly anxious as she examined the panel more closely in the dim candlelight. "Someone must have discovered the passage and sealed it from above." Mira's small face filled with panic. "We have to get to him, Mama. The dark feeling is getting stronger. I can sense it even from here." Elena searched desperately for another way, running her hands along the cold stone walls surrounding the sealed panel, but found nothing that offered any hope of entry. Fear and frustration welled up within her chest, threatening to overwhelm the careful composure she had maintained throughout their long, dangerous journey toward the truth. "We will find another way," Elena said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of their sudden setback. "I promise you, Mira, we will not give up now, not when we have come so far." As they made their way back through the narrow passage, their hearts heavy with disappointment and worry, Elena's mind raced through every possibility, every remaining option that might allow them to reach the king before Corvin's increased poison succeeded in undoing weeks of fragile, hard-won progress. Somewhere above them, within the sealed and silent chapel, where the golden light that had once pulsed so steadily beneath the glass coffin flickered weakly in the darkness, struggling against a shadow that had grown far stronger than before, waiting desperately for a warmth that could no longer reach it through the paths that had once seemed so reliable. Time, it seemed, had finally run out for careful patience. Now, only bold and immediate action remained. Lady Rosalind arrived at the palace gates the following afternoon, her carriage bearing the faded crest of a family that had once held great influence within Eldermore's royal court. She was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a posture that suggested decades spent navigating the delicate and dangerous world of palace politics. Beside her rode two other nobles Elena did not recognize, along with a small escort of trusted guards loyal to the old families, rather than to Corvin's regency. Word spread quickly through the palace that Lady Rosalind had returned after years of quiet absence, and Regent Corvin, clearly caught off guard by her sudden and public arrival, met her in the great hall with a forced smile that did little to hide the tension visible in his sharp features. "Lady Rosalind," Corvin said, his voice carrying carefully controlled politeness. "What an unexpected pleasure. To what do we owe this visit?" "I have come to pay my respects to our king," Rosalind replied, her voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the vast hall. "It has been far too long since I last visited the chapel where he rests. I trust there will be no objection to a simple visit from an old friend of his mother." Corvin's expression flickered with barely concealed alarm. "The chapel has been sealed for the king's protection, given recent disturbances among the staff. I am afraid I cannot permit visitors at this time." "How curious," Rosalind said, her tone remaining pleasant despite the sharp edge now visible beneath her words. "Disturbances, you say? I have heard whispers of strange lights and unexplained warmth radiating from his tomb. Surely, if our king shows any sign of returning to us, the entire kingdom deserves to know the truth, rather than having such news hidden away behind sealed doors." A tense silence fell over the great hall, as nobles and staff members alike exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in power taking place before them. Elena, standing quietly near the back of the gathered crowd alongside Clara, felt her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. Corvin's composure cracked slightly beneath the weight of Rosalind's carefully chosen words. "These are foolish rumors, nothing more. I will not have the kingdom's stability threatened by superstition and idle gossip. Then you will have no objection to allowing Nathaniel, our palace physician, to conduct a full examination of the king in the presence of witnesses," Rosalind replied smoothly. "If there is truly nothing unusual occurring within that chapel, such an examination should put these rumors to rest entirely, and restore confidence among the staff and nobility alike." Corvin's eyes darted briefly toward Gideon, his nervous advisor, who shifted uncomfortably under the sudden scrutiny of the gathered crowd. For a long, tense moment, it seemed as though Corvin might refuse outright, but the growing number of noble witnesses gathered within the hall, along with the careful pressure of Rosalind's calm but unwavering demand, left him little room to maneuver without appearing to have something dangerous to hide. "Very well," Corvin finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "The chapel will be open tomorrow morning, and Nathaniel may conduct his examination in the presence of yourself and whichever witnesses you deem necessary." Rosalind inclined her head slightly, a small, satisfied smile touching the corners of her lips. "Thank you, my lord. I am certain the truth, whatever it may be, will serve the kingdom far better than continued secrecy." As the gathered crowd began to disperse, Elena caught Nathaniel's eye across the great hall, and the quiet nod he offered told her everything she needed to know. Their careful plan had worked, at least for now. Tomorrow, the truth would finally be brought into the light, before witnesses powerful enough that Corvin could no longer simply silence or dismiss them. That night, Elena struggled to sleep, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the following day's examination. She worried desperately about Mira, who had grown increasingly anxious over the sealed passage, and the growing shadow she sensed pressing against the king's fragile progress. "Will it work, Mama?" Mira asked softly, as Elena tucked her into bed, her honey-colored eyes wide with worry. "Will they finally let us help him properly?" "I believe so, sweetheart," Elena said gently, though privately she carried her own uncertainties about what tomorrow might bring. "But I need you to be brave for just a little while longer. Can you do that for me?" Mira nodded solemnly, though sleep did not come easily to either of them that night. The following morning arrived with a tension that seemed to hang over the entire palace like a heavy fog. Elena, Clara, Nathaniel, and Mira gathered outside the chapel doors, alongside Lady Rosalind and several other noble witnesses, while Corvin stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral, despite the visible tightness in his jaw. When the guards finally unlocked the heavy chapel doors, the group filed inside, and Elena's breath caught immediately at the sight before her. The glass coffin, which had glowed with warm golden light during their secret visits, now appeared dim and lifeless once more. The king's face, though still holding faint traces of color, compared to his original marble stillness, looked pale and strained, his features drawn tight, with what could only be described as quiet suffering. Mira gasped softly beside her mother, her small hand tightening around Elena's fingers. "The dark feeling," she whispered under her breath. "It's so strong now." Nathaniel moved forward quickly, opening his satchel and beginning a careful, thorough examination in front of the gathered witnesses. He checked the king's pulse, his breathing, the faint color still visible beneath his skin, narrating each observation clearly for the benefit of those watching. "His condition has changed significantly from my most recent private examination," Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. "There is clear evidence of continued biological activity, inconsistent with true death, yet his vital signs have weakened considerably compared to previous observations. This suggests active interference rather than a natural or unchanging condition." Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles at this announcement. Lady Rosalind stepped forward, her sharp eyes fixed directly on Corvin. "Interference, you say? Perhaps you would care to explain, my lord, why a man declared dead 6 years ago continues to show such inconsistent signs of life, worsening and improving in ways that align suspiciously with periods when access to this chapel has been restricted or granted." Corvin's face had grown pale, his usual sharp composure cracking visibly under the mounting pressure of the gathered witnesses. "I have no knowledge of any such interference," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confident authority. "The king's condition has remained a mystery to physicians and scholars alike for years." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Nathaniel said, producing the small glass vial containing the sample he had collected weeks earlier during their secret visit. This sample, taken directly from the king's resting place, contains clear traces of a rare and dangerous substance known as nightroot extract, a poison capable of mimicking death while trapping its victim in prolonged unconsciousness. It requires continued doses to maintain its effect, doses that could only have been administered by someone with regular, private access to this sealed chapel. The chapel fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned toward Corvin, whose face had drained entirely of color, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, as the carefully constructed lie he had maintained for 6 long years began crumbling irreversibly before the very witnesses who held the power to end his rule entirely. For a long, unbearable moment, no one in the chapel moved or spoke. The weight of Nathaniel's accusation hung heavily in the air, pressing down upon every witness gathered within the ancient stone walls. Corvin's eyes darted frantically between the faces surrounding him, searching desperately for some ally who might come to his defense, but found only cold, suspicious silence in return. "This is absurd," Corvin finally said, though his voice had lost the commanding authority it once carried so easily. "A single sample proves nothing. Anyone could have contaminated the chapel over the years. This physician's accusations are nothing more than dangerous speculation." "Then explain the hooded visitor who arrives at the palace's rear gates under cover of darkness," Clara said suddenly, stepping forward despite her nervousness, her voice trembling but determined. "I have seen him myself, delivering small wooden cases directly to your private study on multiple occasions these past months." Gasps rippled through the gathered nobles at Clara's unexpected testimony. Corvin's jaw tightened visibly, his composure slipping further with each passing moment. "A servant's foolish imagination," Corvin snapped, though the desperation in his voice betrayed the weakness of his denial. "I overheard your conversation myself, my lord," Clara continued, her voice growing steadier now that the truth had finally begun spilling forth. "I heard you instruct this visitor to increase the dosage, specifically because the king's condition had begun improving faster than you anticipated. I heard you say he must never wake. Not now, not ever, if you could help it." The silence that followed Clara's words felt different from before, heavier, more final, as though the last remaining thread holding Corvin's careful deception together had finally snapped entirely. Lady Rosalind stepped forward, her expression cold and unforgiving. 6 years, Corvin," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the stunned chapel. 6 years you have ruled this kingdom under false pretenses, poisoning our rightful king while claiming to protect his rest. 6 years you have silenced anyone who dared question the truth, dismissing loyal guards, threatening honest servants, all to preserve power that was never truly yours to hold. Corvin's expression shifted rapidly between fear and barely controlled fury. I did what was necessary, he finally admitted, his voice low and bitter, all pretense of innocence abandoned entirely. Adrian was reckless, foolish, unfit to rule a kingdom as important as Eldermore. I have governed these lands far more effectively than he ever could have. The people have prospered under my leadership. The people have prospered under a lie, Rosalind replied sharply, and that lie ends today. At a signal from Lady Rosalind, the noble guards who had accompanied her stepped forward, moving to restrain Corvin before he could attempt to flee or call upon whatever remaining loyalty he might still command among the palace guards. Corvin struggled briefly against their grip, his eyes wild with the sudden, crushing realization that 6 years of carefully maintained control had crumbled entirely within the span of a single morning. As the guards led Corvin away toward the palace dungeons to await formal judgment, Elena turned her attention immediately back toward the glass coffin, her heart aching at the sight of the king's pale, strained features. Mira had already moved forward, pressing both small hands against the glass, her expression filled with desperate concentration. "He's so weak, Mama," Mira whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "The dark feeling is still there. I don't know if I can push it away alone." Nathaniel moved quickly to examine the king once more, his expression grave. The increased doses have taken a severe toll on his body. Without immediate intervention, I fear the damage may become permanent, regardless of Corvin's arrest. "What can we do?" Elena asked urgently. Nathaniel hesitated, glancing between his medical instruments and the small, determined girl still pressing her hands against the glass coffin. "Medicine alone cannot undo what has been done. If your daughter's presence has truly been the force pushing back against this poison all along, then perhaps continued, direct closeness, without the interruptions and secrecy we have been forced to maintain, offers our best remaining hope." Lady Rosalind, having overheard this exchange, stepped forward with quiet authority. "Then let it be done properly, and without further delay. Open the coffin fully. Whatever strange bond exists between this child and our king, I have seen enough today to believe it deserves every chance to succeed." Under Nathaniel's careful guidance, the glass coffin was finally opened completely, for the first time in 6 years, the heavy lid lifted away with slow, careful movements by 2 of the noble guards. The king's still form lay exposed at last to open air, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, his face drawn tight with visible suffering. Mira did not hesitate. She climbed gently onto the stone platform and curled herself against the king's chest, resting her small ear directly above his heart, her arms wrapping around him as best they could manage given her small size. She began humming softly once more, the same wordless, gentle tune that had first drawn warmth from cold glass so many weeks earlier. "Come back," she whispered softly between the notes of her quiet song. "Please, we are all here waiting for you now. You are not alone anymore." The chapel fell into a hushed, reverent silence, as everyone present watched and waited, unsure what, if anything, might happen next. Long minutes passed with no visible change, and Elena felt her heart breaking slowly with each passing moment of continued stillness. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the king's chest began to rise more steadily. His fingers, which had remained perfectly still for 6 long years, twitched faintly against the stone platform beneath him. Nathaniel leaned forward immediately, pressing his instrument gently against the king's chest, his eyes widening with genuine astonishment. "His heartbeat is strengthening," Nathaniel announced, his voice filled with disbelief and growing wonder. "Rapidly, more than I have ever witnessed in 6 years of observation." Mira continued humming softly, her small body pressed close against the king's chest, seemingly unaware of the growing crowd of witnesses watching in stunned silence around her. And then, as the golden morning light streamed through the chapel's tall stained glass windows, painting warm colors across the stone floor, King Adrian Voss's eyes slowly, finally, began to open. A collective gasp rippled through the chapel as the king's eyes, dark and unfocused at first, slowly began to clear, blinking against the warm morning light streaming through the stained glass windows above. His chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths, each one stronger than the last, as though 6 years of stillness were finally being released all at once. Mira lifted her head from his chest, her honey-colored eyes wide with joyful wonder, as she looked directly into his face for the first time. The king's gaze, still hazy and confused, slowly focused on the small girl resting against him, and his lips parted slightly, as though searching for words that had not been used in far too long. "Mira," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible, yet unmistakably clear enough for everyone in the silent chapel to hear. Elena felt her breath catch sharply in her throat. He knew her daughter's name. He had somehow, impossibly, heard every whispered word, every gentle song, every quiet promise Mira had offered him throughout their many secret visits, even while trapped in whatever strange, suspended darkness had held him captive for 6 long years. Nathaniel moved forward quickly, his physician's instincts taking over despite his own visible astonishment. "Your Majesty, please remain still. Your body has endured a great deal. We must proceed carefully." King Adrian's eyes shifted slowly around the chapel, taking in the unfamiliar faces gathered before him, the passage of time visible in ways he had not yet begun to fully comprehend. Confusion flickered briefly across his features before his gaze returned once more to Mira, as though her presence alone offered him something solid and certain to hold on to amid the overwhelming disorientation surrounding him. "You spoke to me," he said softly, his voice growing slightly stronger with each word. "Every night I heard you, even when I could not answer. Your voice was the only thing that felt real." Tears filled Mira's eyes as she smiled up at him, her small hand still resting gently against his chest. "I promised I would keep coming back," she said simply. "I always keep my promises." Lady Rosalind stepped forward then, bowing respectfully before the awakened king, despite the emotional weight still hanging heavily in the chapel air. "Your Majesty, welcome back to us. There is a great deal you must learn about what has happened during your absence, but for now, please know that you are safe, and that justice has already begun to be served against those responsible for what was done to you." Over the following hours, as word of the king's awakening spread rapidly throughout the palace and beyond, into the streets and villages of Eldermore itself, the kingdom erupted into a mixture of disbelief, celebration, and cautious hope. Nathaniel remained close by the king's side throughout the day, carefully monitoring his recovery and explaining, with patient detail, everything that had transpired during the 6 years of his unnatural sleep, including the full extent of Corvin's betrayal and deception. King Adrian listened to each revelation with a quiet, steady resolve, his initial confusion gradually giving way to a calm, measured strength that reminded Elena of the descriptions she had heard from older staff members who remembered his early years of rule fondly. Whatever weakness his body still carried from years of suppression, his mind remained sharp, focused, and determined to reclaim the responsibilities that had been stolen from him. That evening, once the immediate chaos of his awakening had settled into a more manageable rhythm, King Adrian requested a private audience with Elena and Mira in the palace's smaller receiving chamber, away from the crowds of curious nobles and excited staff members eager to catch a glimpse of their returned ruler. "I owe you both a debt I do not know how to properly repay," he said, his voice still carrying traces of weakness, but growing steadier with each passing hour. 6 years trapped in darkness, and it was your daughter's kindness, freely given, without any expectation of reward, that finally reached through to bring me back." Elena knelt respectfully before him, though the king quickly gestured for her to rise, his expression carrying a warmth that seemed entirely at odds with the cold, distant descriptions she had once heard whispered about him years earlier. "Please," he said gently. "There has been enough formality and fear surrounding this chapel for far too long. I would rather speak with you simply, as the people who saved my life, than as subjects standing before their king." Mira, never one to hold back her thoughts, stepped forward with the same fearless honesty that had first drawn her to his tomb so many months earlier. "I always knew you would wake up," she said simply. "I just knew your heart needed someone to remind it that people were still waiting for you." King Adrian smiled softly at her words, a genuine, warm expression that seemed to erase years of suffering from his still recovering features. "Your heart, young one, is a remarkable gift. I hope you know how rare and precious such courage and kindness truly are." In the days that followed, Corvin's trial proceeded swiftly, under the careful oversight of Lady Rosalind and the restored royal council. The overwhelming evidence of his deception, leaving little room for doubt or leniency. He was stripped of his title and removed from any position of power within Eldermore, his years of carefully constructed control dismantled entirely as the kingdom slowly began rebuilding trust in its restored leadership. King Adrian, though still recovering his full strength in the weeks that followed his awakening, moved quickly to address the many wrongs committed during Corvin's regency, restoring dismissed guards to their positions, reversing unjust decisions, and working closely with Lady Rosalind and Nathaniel to ensure the kingdom's governance reflected the values he had always intended to uphold before his sudden collapse so many years earlier. Elena and Mira, rather than returning to their previous quiet roles within the palace's service staff, found themselves welcomed instead into King Adrian's inner circle, their bond with him having grown into something far deeper than gratitude alone could explain. Mira, in particular, became a frequent and cherished presence within the king's private chambers, often found curled beside him during quiet evening hours, continuing the same gentle companionship that had first coaxed his heart back into its steady, healthy rhythm. Months later, as autumn settled softly over the kingdom of Eldermore, painting the palace gardens in warm shades of gold and crimson, King Adrian stood upon the same balcony where he had once addressed his people as a young, hopeful ruler many years earlier. Beside him stood Elena, and just ahead, laughing brightly as she chased fallen leaves across the garden path below, ran Mira, her honey-colored eyes bright with the same fearless joy that had once looked past death itself, and found, waiting patiently beneath layers of silence and sorrow, a heart simply longing to be remembered. The people of Eldermore no longer whispered fearfully of the dead king, nor spoke his name with the hushed uncertainty that had surrounded the chapel for 6 long years. Instead, they told a different story now, one passed eagerly from parent to child throughout the kingdom's villages and towns, a story of a small, brave girl who had refused to be afraid of what everyone else called impossible, and who had proven, through nothing more than quiet kindness and unwavering devotion, that even the most silent, forgotten hearts could still be called gently, patiently, back into the light. And King Adrian Voss, once known only as the Dead King, ruled Eldermore once more, not merely as a returned monarch, but as a man forever changed by the simple truth that love, freely given, without condition or fear, held a power far greater than any poison or deception ever could.